The first-class cabin smelled of leather and money. Soft conversations hummed in the background, accompanied by the occasional clink of a champagne glass. Overhead bins clicked shut as passengers settled in, adjusting designer bags and expensive watches. Karoline Leavitt slipped into seat 5B, gracefully placing her sleek leather briefcase under the seat in front of her. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her blonde hair falling neatly past her shoulders, an iPad already in hand as she prepared for the 3-hour flight from Dallas to Tampa. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our latest content. Karoline had mastered the art of professional composure. Years of handling press conferences, crafting statements under intense scrutiny, and maintaining poise in the White House press room had given her a quiet confidence that she carried effortlessly. Today was no different. The flight was a brief respite between meetings, a rare moment to catch up on reading and prepare for tomorrow's speaking engagement. She accepted a sparkling water from the flight attendant with a polite smile, her attention already returning to the briefing documents on her tablet. Political communications never stopped, especially not for someone of her caliber. Even in transit, there were statements to review, talking points to refine, and an inbox that seemed to multiply by the minute. A commotion several rows behind caught her attention briefly. Someone settling into their seat with more fanfare than necessary, ordering a scotch in a voice designed to carry. Karoline didn't look up. She'd long ago learned to filter out distractions, to focus only on what mattered. It was a skill that had served her well throughout her career. She swiped to the next page of her document, making a mental note about a particular statistic she wanted to highlight in tomorrow's presentation. The plane began taxiing, and the familiar announcements played overhead. Karoline handed her empty glass to the flight attendant, her movements efficient and composed, her focus unwavering. What she didn't notice, or perhaps simply chose not to acknowledge, was the man watching her from seat 3A. Nathan Kessler, a mid-level executive with an inflated sense of self-importance, had spotted her the moment he boarded. There was something about her that piqued his interest, something that made him want to place her in a category he could understand. He nudged the unfortunate passenger beside him. "Ever notice how some people think money can buy class?" he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby seats. The man beside him gave a non-committal response, clearly uninterested in conversation, but Nathan was undeterred. "She looks familiar," he continued, nodding in Karoline's direction. "Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type. Big hair, expensive handbag, and no idea how to blend in." His words floated through the cabin, catching a few glances and raised eyebrows. But Karoline remained focused on her work, either genuinely unaware of his commentary or choosing not to give it her attention. She highlighted a passage, made a note in the margin, and continued reading as the plane lifted off the runway. To Nathan, her lack of reaction was intriguing. People usually reacted to him, whether with laughter, irritation, or indulgence. Her indifference was unusual, and it only made him more determined to provoke a response. "She must have married well," he mused, still loud enough to be overheard. "That's usually how these stories go. Third husband, maybe fourth, plastic surgeon on speed dial. It's always the same." This time, there was a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. A businessman across the aisle glanced at him with thinly veiled disapproval. The flight attendant paused momentarily as she passed. Even his seatmate seemed to shrink further into his magazine, distancing himself from Nathan's commentary. But Karoline didn't flinch. She had weathered far worse than the idle speculations of a stranger on a plane. She'd stood firm against hostile press corps, navigated political landmines, and crafted messages that shaped national conversations. The opinions of one presumptuous man in first class hardly registered on her radar. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Karoline adjusted slightly in her seat, scrolling to the next section of her report. She was reviewing polling data, mentally preparing for potential questions she might face tomorrow. Her concentration was complete, her posture perfectly balanced between professional and relaxed. Nathan, meanwhile, was growing increasingly irritated by her apparent immunity to his comments. He flagged down a flight attendant with an exaggerated wave. "Another scotch," he said, handing over his empty glass. Then with a nod toward Karoline, he added, "And whatever she's having, too." "On me." The flight attendant's expression remained neutral. "She's fine, sir," she replied smoothly, taking his glass and moving away before he could press further. Nathan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. He turned to his reluctant seatmate, who had now opened a book in a clear bid to avoid conversation. "You ever notice that?" Nathan asked, tapping the armrest between them. "How some people walk around like they're the main character in life, like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie?" The man gave him a brief glance before returning to his book. "Haven't really thought about it." Nathan grinned, undeterred. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, his voice perfectly calibrated to carry without being overtly rude. "She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name, on favors. Some senator's ex-wife, maybe? Or one of those lawyers who loves the camera but couldn't win a case to save her life." He let the words linger, waiting for a reaction, a turn of the head, a subtle shift in posture, anything that would indicate he had gotten under her skin. Nothing. Karoline continued reading her tablet, completely unaffected, or at least appearing so. Her focus remained intact, her composure undisturbed. She highlighted another passage, made another note, completely immersed in her work. Nathan's frustration grew. "Not even a glance," he muttered, adjusting his watch. "Guess she's too important for the rest of us." Around the cabin, passengers were beginning to take notice of his behavior. A woman in a navy pantsuit exchanged a knowing look with her seatmate. An older gentleman glanced up from his newspaper, one eyebrow slightly raised. But Nathan, caught in his own narrative, interpreted their attention as agreement. He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Mark my words," he said, smirking. "She's going to post something later about how exhausting travel is. Probably complain about manspreading or some nonsense. Women like her love playing the victim, but I guarantee you—" "Excuse me, sir." The voice was calm, measured, professional. For the first time since boarding, Karoline had turned to face Nathan directly. Her expression was neutral, her eyes clear and steady. There was no anger, no irritation, just a focused attention that immediately commanded respect. Nathan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. This close, there was something even more familiar about her, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. He waited for her to continue to scold him or express offense, giving him the opportunity to be charming, to smooth things over with a well-practiced smile. But Karoline simply held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to her tablet without another word. The briefest acknowledgement, followed by a dismissal so complete, it left Nathan scrambling to recover his composure. In that moment, something shifted in the dynamic of the cabin. Without saying a single word, Karoline had redirected the attention, leaving Nathan exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. He adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit he'd never quite overcome, and tried to regain his footing. "Just making conversation," he said to no one in particular, his voice lacking its previous confidence. No one responded. His seatmate remained firmly entrenched in his book. The flight attendant returned with his scotch, setting it down with professional courtesy before moving on without engaging in the small talk he usually inspired. Nathan sipped his drink, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over him. He glanced at Karoline again, studying her profile. Karen, he remembered the flight attendant calling her. Karen something. The name tickled at his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. She was still reading, still composed, still projecting that aura of quiet competence that had initially irritated him. But now, having briefly experienced her direct attention, he found himself oddly compelled to regain it. "Karen, is it?" he said, pitching his voice to sound casual. "You don't look like a Karen." Karoline didn't respond, continuing to read her document as if he hadn't spoken. Nathan pressed on, uncomfortable with the silence. "I mean, no offense," he added with a forced chuckle. "It's just, I don't know. You look more like a Kelly or a Lauren." He shook his head. "Karen sounds like someone's mom." Still nothing, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Nathan shifted in his seat, increasingly aware that he was the only one talking, that other passengers were listening, but not in the way he had intended. Across the aisle, the older gentleman had returned to his newspaper, but the slight downward turn of his mouth spoke volumes. 2 rows ahead, a younger man in a business suit was typing on his laptop, but his posture suggested he was listening intently. The realization slowly dawned on Nathan. They weren't entertained by his commentary. They were judging him for it. He exhaled sharply, settling back in his seat. Fine. Let them judge. People were always so sensitive these days, so quick to misconstrue a bit of harmless observation as something malicious. He hadn't said anything that bad. He finished his scotch in one swift motion, setting the glass down with a little more force than necessary. At that exact moment, as if orchestrated by some cosmic force determined to teach him a lesson, the flight attendant approached Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt, would you like another beverage?" she asked. Nathan's brain stuttered on the name. Not Karen, Leavitt. Karoline Leavitt. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Former White House Assistant Press Secretary, National Spokesperson for Congressional Republicans. A rising star in political communications who had gone toe-to-toe with the Washington press corps and emerged victorious. A woman whose face had been on major news networks, whose statements had shaped national conversations. A woman who most definitely wasn't some reality TV reject or trophy wife. Nathan's throat went dry as the full implications settled in. He had spent the past 20 minutes loudly disparaging one of the most recognizable political communicators in the country, someone whose career was built on deftly handling much more formidable opponents than him. He stole another glance at her, but Karoline wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. She had acknowledged him once, just long enough to let him know she was aware of his comments, and then had returned to matters more deserving of her attention. For Karoline, this was hardly the first time she'd encountered someone like Nathan. Throughout her career, she had faced dismissive comments, underestimation, and attempts to diminish her achievements. She had learned early on that responding to every slight was not only exhausting, but counterproductive. She chose her battles carefully, reserving her energy for what truly mattered. Nathan's commentary was nothing compared to what she had faced in White House briefings and political campaigns. She had stood firm against seasoned journalists and political opponents who had years of experience and institutional power behind them. A businessman with an inflated ego hardly registered as a challenge. Still, she had heard every word. She had registered every assumption, every stereotype, every dismissive remark. And she had made a conscious choice to let him continue, to give him enough rope to hang himself with his own prejudice. It wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was simply about allowing natural consequences to unfold. Nathan swallowed hard, his mind racing through options. Should he apologize? Pretend he had known who she was all along? Try to salvage some dignity from this increasingly mortifying situation? I thought you looked familiar," he finally said, forcing a light chuckle. "Didn't realize I was in the presence of Washington royalty." Karoline didn't respond. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge him in any way. She simply continued reading her tablet, as composed as she had been since boarding. Nathan's stomach twisted uncomfortably. Her silence was worse than any retort she could have delivered. If she had engaged, if she had responded with anger or indignation, he could have navigated that, could have apologized or defended himself, or found some way to reestablish equal footing. But her complete indifference left him floundering, stripped of his usual social tactics. I actually followed some of your work," he tried again, keeping his tone conversational. "You've had quite the career." Nothing, not even a glance. Nathan shifted in his seat, suddenly very aware of how long the flight still had to go. What had seemed like an entertaining 3 hours now stretched before him like an eternity, with no escape from the uncomfortable situation he had created. Just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the flight attendant returned. "Another drink, sir?" she asked. Nathan hesitated. The thought of another scotch, of continuing to sit here with lowered inhibitions and a loosened tongue, suddenly seemed like a terrible idea. "Just water," he muttered. As the flight attendant nodded and moved away, Nathan caught a glimpse of something he hadn't expected, the slightest curve at the corner of Karoline's mouth. Not quite a smile, but a momentary acknowledgement of the shift in dynamic. She hadn't turned toward him, hadn't spoken a word, but in that fraction of a second, he knew she was aware of everything: his discomfort, his realization, his attempt to recalibrate. For the first time in a long time, Nathan Kessler felt genuinely small. Karoline continued her work with the same steady focus she had maintained since boarding. To an outside observer, nothing had changed. She was still reading documents, still making notes, still preparing for tomorrow's engagements. But internally, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had encountered countless men like Nathan throughout her career. Men who looked at her and saw only a blonde woman, who assumed her success was tied to her appearance or connections, rather than her intelligence and work ethic. Men who felt entitled to comment on her existence, to categorize her based on their limited understanding of the world. In her early days in politics, such encounters had rattled her. She had spent too much energy defending herself, proving her credentials, demanding the respect she deserved. But experience had taught her a more effective approach, to let her work speak for itself, to choose carefully when to engage and when to redirect her focus to what truly mattered. Today's encounter was barely a blip in her day. The man's assumptions about her were so far removed from reality that they didn't even merit correction. She had more important things to focus on: tomorrow's panel discussion on economic policy, the media strategy for next month's legislative push, the ongoing messaging coordination with congressional offices. She highlighted another passage in her briefing document, adding a note about data that needed clarification. The plane hummed around her, the familiar white noise creating a cocoon of concentration. She was good at this, at maintaining focus regardless of circumstances, at compartmentalizing distractions, at directing her energy toward productive ends. Across the cabin, Nathan sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of his misjudgment heavy on his shoulders. He sipped his water slowly, trying to process what had happened. How had he misread the situation so completely? How had he failed to recognize someone so prominent in her field? The answer, of course, was that he hadn't really looked. He had seen what he expected to see, a beautiful woman in first class, and had immediately assigned her to a category that made sense within his limited worldview. He hadn't considered that she might be accomplished in her own right, that her presence in first class might be tied to her professional achievements, rather than her personal relationships. The realization was uncomfortable, forcing him to confront assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making. His fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest as he tried to find a way forward, some path to redeeming himself in a situation that seemed increasingly beyond salvaging. Karoline, meanwhile, moved seamlessly to her next task. She opened her email, efficiently sorting through messages that had accumulated during takeoff. She flagged priority items, drafted quick responses where needed, and created a mental list of calls to make upon landing. Her workflow was practiced, honed through years of managing crises and juggling competing demands. She was aware peripherally of Nathan's discomfort. She could sense his restlessness, his desire to somehow recover from his social misstep. But she had no obligation to ease his embarrassment or to help him feel better about himself. That wasn't her job, not in this cabin, not in her professional life, not in any context. The flight continued in relative quiet. The hum of the engines, the occasional ding of the service bell, the muted conversations of other passengers created a backdrop against which Karoline continued her work, and Nathan sat in silent reflection. As they began their initial descent into Tampa, Karoline closed her tablet and slipped it into its case. She had accomplished what she had set out to do, reviewing her briefing materials, responding to priority emails, preparing mentally for tomorrow's engagements. The flight had been productive, despite the minor distraction. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their approach to Tampa International Airport. Passengers began the usual pre-landing routines, collecting personal items, adjusting seats, preparing for arrival. Karoline checked her phone briefly before switching it to airplane mode, confirming the time of her car service. Nathan watched her from the corner of his eye, still trying to reconcile the woman he had assumed she was with the reality of who she actually was. It wasn't just about her job title or political affiliation. It was about the composure she had maintained, the way she had chosen not to engage with his provocations, the quiet confidence that suggested she had nothing to prove to anyone, least of all to him. There was a lesson here, if he was willing to learn it, about assumptions and prejudice, about the stories we tell ourselves about strangers, about the limitations of our own perspectives, about the power of quiet dignity over performative outrage. As the plane touched down on the runway, tires squealing against concrete, Nathan made a decision. He would apologize, not because he expected forgiveness or because he wanted to salvage his reputation, but because it was the right thing to do. Because acknowledging his mistake was the first step toward not repeating it. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began standing, reaching for overhead compartments, preparing to disembark. Karoline gathered her belongings efficiently, waiting for her turn to enter the aisle. Nathan timed his own movements carefully, ensuring that he would reach the aisle at the same moment she did. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best opportunity he was likely to get. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all flight, "I owe you an apology." Karoline turned toward him, her expression neutral but attentive. She didn't speak, but she was listening, which was more than he deserved. "My behavior was inexcusable," Nathan continued, awkwardly aware of the passengers around them, some of whom were obviously listening. "I made assumptions about you that were unfair and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Well, they say more about me than they do about you." Karoline regarded him steadily, her blue eyes clear and direct. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction at his discomfort, just a measured assessment. She had dealt with far worse than Nathan Kessler, had navigated far more complex situations than an awkward apology in an airplane aisle. After a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, she spoke. "Apology accepted, Mr. Kessler," he supplied quickly. "Nathan Kessler." She nodded once, efficiently acknowledging the information. "Mr. Kessler," she paused, considering her words carefully. "You know, the most powerful moment in a conversation isn't when someone speaks, it's when they choose to listen." Another slight pause. "Maybe next time, try that approach first." With that, she turned and continued down the aisle, her movements as composed and purposeful as they had been throughout the flight. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't delivered a scathing rebuke. She had simply offered a perspective, one that Nathan desperately needed to hear. He stood there for a moment, processing her words as passengers moved past him, eager to disembark. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more valuable. It was wisdom. For Karoline, the exchange was already fading from her thoughts as she made her way through the terminal. She had a car waiting, a hotel reservation confirmed, and a busy schedule ahead. The flight and Nathan Kessler were simply part of the journey, not destinations worthy of lingering attention. She spotted her driver holding a sign with her name, moved efficiently toward him, and exchanged brief pleasantries as he took her carry-on bag. Within minutes, she was settled in the back seat of a black town car, reviewing her schedule for the evening. "Directly to the hotel, Ms. Leavitt?" the driver asked. "Yes, please, she replied, already opening her tablet again. "I have a conference call in 30 minutes. As the car pulled away from the curb, Karoline allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The encounter on the plane wasn't unusual. Throughout her career, she had faced similar assumptions, similar dismissals, similar underestimations. Each time she had chosen how to respond based not on emotional reaction, but on strategic assessment. Sometimes engaging directly served a purpose. Other times, as with Nathan Kessler, silent dignity was the more powerful choice. She had learned long ago that her energy was a finite resource, best directed toward goals that mattered, toward people who deserved her attention. Nathan, meanwhile, collected his bag from the overhead bin and made his way slowly through the terminal, his thoughts unusually introspective. He hailed a taxi, giving the driver the name of his hotel in a subdued voice. "Downtown Marriott, please." As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Nathan found himself thinking about the flight, about the lesson he had learned at 35,000 feet. How often had he judged people based on appearance, on first impressions, on assumptions that said more about his own biases than about the people themselves? How many times had he missed the opportunity to learn, to understand, to connect, because he was too busy talking to listen? The taxi wound its way through Tampa traffic as Nathan pulled out his phone, opened the Notes app, and began to type. Not a client email, not a business proposal, but something for himself. a reminder of the person he wanted to become. Listen first, he wrote. Judge less. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Karoline had arrived at her hotel. She checked in efficiently, thanked the staff, and made her way to her room. The moment the door closed behind her, she kicked off her heels, set up her laptop, and prepared for her conference call. There was work to be done, messages to craft, strategies to refine. Tonight, she would review tomorrow's talking points, check in with her team, and get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow, she would deliver a keynote address that would be quoted in major publications. The day after, she would meet with party leaders to discuss messaging for the upcoming legislative session. And Nathan Kessler? He would fade from her memory, just another man who had underestimated her, one in a long line that had failed to slow her down or divert her from her path. Because for Karoline Leavitt, success wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about staying focused on what mattered, about maintaining composure in the face of dismissal, about choosing which battles deserved her energy and which ones didn't. In the end, that was the real power, not in responding to every provocation, but in deciding which ones merited attention, not in demanding respect, but in conducting herself in a way that commanded it, not in telling others who she was, but in showing them through her actions, her decisions, her work. As Karoline prepared for her call, organizing her notes with practiced efficiency, she didn't think about Nathan Kessler. She thought about policy points and communication strategies, about effective messaging and compelling narratives. Because that was who Karoline Leavitt was, a professional focused on her goals, undeterred by those who failed to see her clearly, unmoved by those who tried to diminish her worth. She had built her career on substance rather than spectacle, on competence rather than controversy. And that night, as Tampa's lights sparkled outside her hotel window, as she finalized preparations for tomorrow's address, Karoline embodied the lesson that Nathan was just beginning to learn. That true strength isn't found in dominating conversations or asserting superiority, but in knowing your worth so completely that you don't need others to acknowledge it. The next morning, as Karoline took the stage at her conference, poised and prepared, Nathan sat in his own meeting across town, listening more carefully than he ever had before. They would never cross paths again, but the brief intersection of their lives had created ripples that would continue long after their plane had landed. For Karoline, it was simply another day of doing what she did best, communicating with clarity, navigating complex political landscapes, shaping narratives that resonated with audiences. For Nathan, it was the beginning of a different way of moving through the world, with more awareness, more humility, more willingness to listen before speaking. And perhaps that was the beauty of it all, how a 3-hour flight could contain lessons that lasted far longer, how a brief encounter could prompt reflection that extended far deeper, how sometimes the most powerful statements aren't made with words at all, but with dignity, composure, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. As Karoline delivered her opening remarks, commanding the attention of everyone in the room, she demonstrated exactly what Nathan had failed to see when he first spotted her on the plane. That some people don't need to announce their importance. They simply embody it through their actions, their conduct, their unwavering focus on what truly matters. And in that understanding lay the heart of the story, not about someone being put in their place, but about someone being shown a better way to exist in the world. Not about humiliation, but about growth. Not about winning or losing, but about choosing which games are worth playing in the first place. In the end, Karoline Leavitt hadn't needed to say much to Nathan Kessler. She had simply existed, confidently and unapologetically. And that had been enough to challenge his perspective and expand his understanding. Sometimes the most profound lessons come not from grand confrontations, but from quiet moments of clarity. At 35,000 feet, in the aisle of an airplane, in the space between assumption and reality. And sometimes the most powerful response to underestimation isn't outrage or correction, but simply proving, through consistent excellence, just how wrong that underestimation was.